Week 16 of the fantasy football season, and he has top 36 receivers. I'm ranking number one Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins after missing a week for Tyreek Hill. I think he comes back with a big ball game. This is a big one for the Dolphins. They're still playing for the division, and this is a playoff type of game with these two good teams going at it. So Tyreek Hill, after a week off, getting the batteries recharged and that ankle 100%, and him and two of the most lethal combination in the league, quarterback to receiver. I think once again he goes out there and there's a big game. Number two, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So this Eagle team, they're free-falling a little bit, losing 3 games in a row now, even though it's been pretty solid teams, but losing a heartbreaker on Monday night last week where they were leading the whole game, and Drew Lock and that offense drove down the field and won the ball game. So A.J. Brown, a physical wide receiver. This Giants secondary has definitely improved over the last few weeks and played better, but it's young guys back there. And this Philly team, I think their best chance to win is force-feeding A.J. Brown and making him make big plays. So this week, he might be a little bit up there in my rankings, a few spots. But versus Giant defense, I think he goes out there and has a good game. And he's got a great track record versus them as well. Number 3, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jefferson, he returned last week after he left that game a couple weeks ago versus the Vegas Raiders in Week 14 with the chest injury. And this week, a good matchup versus the Lions, a team he's very familiar with. Indoor game for Minnesota, and this Viking team still in the playoff hunt, even though they lost a tough one last week at the Cincinnati Bengals, a game they were leading. So Jefferson, one of the best receivers in the league, obviously. This season, Tyreek Hill outplayed him. Injuries have played a concern, but this week versus Detroit in a home game, I think Jefferson goes out there, and he could be the number 1 receiver in points this week. That's what he could do on any given week. Number 4, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So CeeDee Lamb and this Cowboy offense definitely took a step back last week at the Bills. But I know CeeDee Lamb still went out there and he found the end zone, even though it was a garbage time touchdown in the fourth quarter. But CeeDee Lamb's an explosive receiver, one of the best this year, no doubt about it. And this week, we'll see if it's Jalen Ramsey covering Lamb the majority of the game or playing one side of the field. And CeeDee Lamb's that type of talent that it just doesn't matter the matchup. He's a guy you go out there and put in your lineup and expect a big game pretty much weekly. Number 5, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So St. Brown, one of the best route runners in the league. This is another player who's having a monster season. Last week, 112 yards and a touchdown versus the Denver Broncos. And this week in Minnesota, a team he's had good history against, and a team that this Lion and Viking team see each other twice a year, and it's usually shootouts. I think St. Brown goes out there once again and has a big ball game. Number 6, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. So this Bill team, I know they're starting to run the football and put an emphasis on it over the last few weeks since they changed offensive coordinators in Buffalo, and it's working for them, no doubt about it. Beating the Kansas City Chiefs and then blowing out the Dallas Cowboys last week. So this week, a good matchup at the Chargers, a defense that obviously don't stop anyone. And Stephon Diggs, he's due for that big game. After the last few weeks, like I mentioned, it's been a run-first type of approach for Buffalo. But this game at the Chargers, they could throw all day if they want to, and I think that's what's going to happen. Number 7, Cooper Kupp, Los Angeles Rams. And Cooper Kupp finally had that huge game going over 100 yards and finding the end zone for this Ram team. And I know Kupp hasn't been 100% all season, but this week a good matchup versus New Orleans Saints, a team that's vulnerable versus the pass. I know last week they played good D, but we know this Giant team don't have any wide receivers. So Cooper Kupp, he looks healthy. Him and Stafford on the same page. And this Ram team, they're looking to make a playoff push. And right now, they're right in the thick of things. Again, one of those last wild cards. So this week, Thursday night, usually shootouts. I think Kupp goes out there once again and is in big game. Number 8, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. I don't know if Pittman's going to play in this game, but he's progressing well, supposedly, after taking that monster hit by KZ, and he got suspended for the season. So this week it is a good matchup with the Falcons. Indoor game, always a plus, especially this time of season. And if Pittman does play, he's been a top wide receiver this year. A guy approaching 100 catches and 1,000 yards, so it's been a great year for Michael Pittman. And him and Gardner Minshew have had a great rapport all year. Number 9, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So this week, a great matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, a secondary that can't stop anyone. We saw Deebo Samuel go bonkers last week, finding the end zone twice. And DJ Moore, great route runner. And him and Justin Fields really have a good rapport. So Moore, it's been a very solid first season for him over there in Chicago. And I know he might be a little bit up there on this list, but like I said, he's running all the routes. He's making big plays weekly as DJ Moore, and it's about time more people give him recognition as a top 10, top 15 receiver this season. Number 10, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Mike Evans, it's been another great year for him. I know the last few weeks the numbers have dipped off a little bit, but Chris Godwin getting a little bit more involved in this offense for Tampa Bay. But this week, a great matchup versus Jacksonville Jaguars, where you could score on them, even though they're a team that at times they stop you in the red zone and they do create turnovers. But Mike Evans all season's been putting up numbers. Him and Baker Mayfield playing at a high level. And this week, once again, I think Evans has a great game. Number 11, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. So we know Deebo's always been a top talent. We know he's been a good receiver, gadget guy, and he's got that home run ability every time he touches the football. But injuries have held him back over the last few seasons. But the last couple weeks, he's been one of the best receivers in fantasy football. But this week, definitely a tough matchup, and one of the tougher matchups you'll see all season, and a potential Super Bowl matchup versus the Ravens coming to town here on Monday Night Football. So Deebo Samuel, an explosive wide receiver, found the end zone twice last week. And this week, I think versus Baltimore, they're going to find ways to get him in space and make plays, because we know Kyle Shanahan, one of the best offensive schemes he's got going in the league. Number 12, Davante Adams, the Las Vegas Raiders. Adams, the last couple weeks, he's starting to get back on track. And last week, everyone exploded for this Raider team in the 63-21 victory versus the Chargers. So this week, no doubt about it, a very tough matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs, where their defense is one of the better secondaries in the league, believe it or not. But Davante Adams, we know he's a big-time player in big-time situations for fantasy owners. We've seen it throughout the seasons. And this week at Kansas City, I think he could go out there and still be a low-end one, number 2 option for owners. Number 13, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith, he's on the New York Giants throughout his career. He's a deep ball threat. And this Eagle team, I just don't know what it's been over the last few weeks. Their offense, very pedestrian. They're not finishing off drives. And when you got receivers like A.J. Brown and Smith, Jalen Hurts at times, he's been passive and looking to run a little bit too much. So this week here, I think this Eagle team, they got to drop back and just throw that football out there to these guys, Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown, because these guys can go out there and make plays even on horrible passes at times. So this week in a matchup versus the Giants secondary that isn't all that great, I think Devonta Smith, like I said, who's had a great track record versus the Giants, has a breakout game. 14, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. And now with Deebo back in 100% here, Ayuk's taking a little bit of a backseat, even though pretty much you could pencil him in 15 or more fantasy points weekly. Besides last week having that bad game, only scoring 3.5 fantasy points in PPR leagues. So Brandon Ayuk, a great route runner. In my opinion, he's still the number 1 wide receiver over there in San Francisco, because he's more consistent and he's more of a traditional receiver, where Deebo is a player you move all around the formation and find ways to give him space. 15, Puka Nacua, a Los Angeles Rams. So what a rookie season it's been here for Puka Nacua. And this Ram offense very lethal with Kyren Williams, Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua. So Nacua, I know the last few weeks it's been one great game and one mid-performance. But this week versus New Orleans Thursday night, like I always mention, shootout type of performances these games are. I think Puka Nacua has one of his better games of the season. Solid 2 receiver for owners this week. 16, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. And Jalen Waddle last week had his biggest game of the year, going over 140 yards and finding the end zone. And obviously that had to do a lot with Tyreek Hill out of the lineup. But this season, Waddle's 2 best games have been versus the New York Jets, going over 100 yards twice in those matchups. So this week here, a little bit of a tougher matchup versus the Cowboys. We don't know if it's going to be Stephon Gilmore or DeRon Bland here versus Jalen Waddle. But I think Waddle is a good enough of a receiver no matter the matchup that you got to put him in your lineup. The only knock on Waddle this season, the targets haven't been there consistently. And also, he's left a lot of games injured and returned because he's just a tough wide receiver that wants to go out there and make plays. 17, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Keenan Allen, we know he's been a top wide receiver this season. Over 100 catches, PPR machine, no doubt about it. But now this week in a tough matchup versus Buffalo that shut down a good Cowboy offense. And now Easton Stick is the quarterback as well for this Charger team. I don't really see Keenan Allen going out there and putting elite numbers. I still believe he could go out there and have a decent game for fantasy owners, but he's not going to put up those 30, 40-point games like we've seen early in the season. So this week in a tough matchup, and he's got a quarterback that really hasn't had rapport with Keenan Allen, especially last week missing that game. I think Keenan Allen's a number 2 receiver for owners this week. 18, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Rashee Rice, easily the number 1 guy over there in Kansas City in the passing game. And pretty much weekly now, it seems like he's finding the end zone. And this week versus Raider defense, even though they've won last week and they held down Minnesota to 3 points a few weeks ago, I think Rashee Rice once again is going to find the end zone and have a good fantasy day. 19, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So Chris Olave, he missed last week's ball game for this New Orleans Saints team. But this week, he's expected to play in this one at the Los Angeles Rams. Olave this season, it's been an up and down first year with Derek Carr quarterback for this Saints team. But Chris Olave and Carr, they've been getting on the same page the last few weeks before he missed last week's game. So this week in a matchup with a potential shootout, especially on Thursday Night Football, I think Chris Olave bounces back after coming off the injury and has a decent ball game. Number 20, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So Amari Cooper, it's been a solid season for Cooper once again with this Brown team, even with the carousel of quarterback of Deshaun Watson, Thompson Robinson, E.J. Walker for a few games, and now the last few weeks him and Joe Flacco have been on the same page. And this week a pretty good matchup at the Houston Texans, where their defense hasn't been all that great versus wide receivers. So I know there's some weeks Cooper disappears, but with a veteran quarterback like Joe Flacco, who knows where he's got to get the football and who his main targets are. We've seen it over the last few weeks. Cooper and Njoku, the two main targets in the passing game, are getting the job done. And this week, once again, I think Cooper has a good one. 21, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. So DK Metcalf, we know, is a big-time wide receiver. This week, we don't know for sure if it's going to be Geno Smith or Drew Lock. We thought Geno was going to come back last week, but he didn't give it a go. And Drew Lock played an alright ball game, but in the fourth quarter when it mattered, last drive of the game, they drove down, and Metcalf had some big plays on that drive to lead them to the end zone. So this week, a good matchup at the Tennessee Titans, where you could throw the football, and receivers have had field days on them all season. So I think Metcalf goes out there once again and has a nice game. And this Seahawk team, they know it's a big game as well to keep their playoff chances, which is slim by right now, but alive. Number 22, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So we'll see if Nico Collins plays in this game for this Texan team. But obviously, C.J. Stroud most likely out once again because of the concussion. And it's a bad concussion that he missed last week's game and expected to miss this game. This week, once again, it's going to be Case Keenum at quarterback. I know Keenum don't have a great arm. I know he's not that great of a quarterback, even though a few years ago he was all right with the Minnesota Vikings in that one season. But he's been a journeyman backup. And this week versus a tough Cleveland defense, it might be tough sledding a little bit. But Nico Collins is a good route runner. And remember last season, there was a lot of games in the second half, especially garbage time. Nico Collins had good ball games with Davis Mills at quarterback. So even with Case Keenum at quarterback, I don't think it's a huge impact on his fantasy value, because as long as Keenum can get the ball clean, we know Collins is a good route runner and he can make some big plays. 23, T. Higgins, the Cincinnati Bengals. So Jamar Chase most likely going to be out of this one with the shoulder injury, and T. Higgins now has to step up as the number one wide receiver. And last week we saw a big game from Higgins with 2 touchdowns. So him and Jake Browning have had good rapport over the last few weeks. T. Higgins definitely hasn't been 100% for the majority of the season, but this week's a big opportunity for him as the number one guy, and it's a contract season as well. So Cincinnati's playing well the last few weeks, even with Burrow out, 3 victories in a row. Pittsburgh's secondary's been hit or miss for the most part the last couple weeks, where we've seen even Gardner Minshew go out there last week and have a big ball game. So I think T. Higgins, as long as he's healthy, and this week he's going to get more target share with Jamar Chase out, he's a solid number 2 wide receiver for owners this week. 24, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So a good matchup for Wilson and the Jets this week with the Commanders coming to town. And their defense obviously can't stop anyone. They traded 2 key pieces at the deadline in Chase Young and Montez Sweat. And Garrett Wilson's a great route runner, even with bad quarterback play all year. With Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, 2 games he played before they cut him loose. And also Trevor Siemian's coming in relief. So this week it's going to be Wilson or Siemian, depending if Wilson could recover in time from the concussion or not. But either way, Garrett Wilson with bad quarterback play, like I said, gone out there. He's put up fantasy points. He can make all the plays. He's a highlight reel type of wide receiver. And he's got that breakaway speed as well, that one move he could beat his secondary. So this week versus the Commanders, even if it's Siemian or Wilson, he goes out there and has a solid game. 25, Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So Courtland Sutton, it's been one of the better years of his NFL career, and it's got a lot to do with health. Courtland Sutton's missed a lot of games the last few seasons because of his health, but this year him and Russell Wilson on the same page. He's easily the number 1 target on this Denver Bronco offense, a good deep ball threat, and a guy who can run the middle of the field and make some big plays. So this week here versus New England secondary that's been banged up all season, and receivers have had good games. We saw Rashee Rice last week go over 80 yards in front of the end zone. I think Sutton once again goes out there and has a solid performance. 26, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So with the quarterback change going from Joshua Dobbs to Nick Mullins, definitely made a big impact for this offense as a whole, where they put points on the board and they made some plays. And Addison last week, a monster ball game with 2 touchdowns and over 100 yards. So this week in a potential shootout between division rival with the Detroit Lions coming it down. I think Jordan Addison once again has a solid game. I'm not saying he's going to go out there and have the big performance like he did last week, but definitely someone who's got capability now to go anywhere from 50 to 100 yards in this game and possibly find the end zone. Number 27, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So Scary Terry finally had a monster game last week, going over 140 yards and finding the end zone. And him and Sam Howell, the last 3 weeks before last week's breakout game at the Rams, they weren't on the same page, and he failed to reach double-digit fantasy points in that time. And this week here, I know it's not a great matchup with the Jets, where they got one of the better defenses and secondaries in the league, but just in terms of Terry McLaurin coming off a big ball game and was still one of the more underrated wide receivers in the game, even versus a tough Jets secondary. We've seen receivers have big games this season. We even saw it last week where Jalen Waddle went over 140 yards and found the end zone. So Terry McLaurin, I think, is a flex option or a number 3 receiver for fantasy owners, even in a tough matchup. Could have a decent game. 28, Calvin Ridley of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Calvin Ridley, it's been an up and down first season for him over here with the Jacksonville Jaguars after getting suspended all last season. So Calvin Ridley, we know he's a good route runner. We know he could go out there and make plays, but some weeks he just hasn't shown up where he's had poor games, and there's some weeks where he's had the big games. So inconsistency has definitely been the name of the game for Ridley this season. And this week we don't know if it's going to be Lawrence or C.J. Beathard, because Lawrence still in the concussion protocol at the time of recording this video. But this week a decent matchup at Tampa Bay. And most of these Buck games have been shootouts for the most part over the last few weeks. So I think Calvin Ridley, he'll be operating as the number 1 guy, obviously, at the receiver, with Christian Kirk out an extended period of time still. And Zay Jones, I doubt he's going to play in this game after he pulled up lame with either a hamstring or a knee injury. So Calvin Ridley as a flex or a number 2 receiver this week, I think could be decent. 29, Chris Godwin, staying in the same game of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Chris Godwin, we know, is a good route runner. We know he has great hands, but this season he's definitely hasn't done much until last week where he went over 140 yards with one of his biggest games of his NFL career. So him and Baker Mayfield finally might be clicking. And this is a good offense with Rachaad White, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin over here for this Tampa Bay Buck team. So this week in a matchup versus Jacksonville, where they do create turnovers, but they do give up points as well, I think Chris Godwin could have a decent game, but I'm not expecting him to go over 100 yards once again in this one. Number 30, Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. So it's been a mixed bag of results here for Tyler Lockett this season. We know every year he's in 1,000-yard wideout, but this season there's been a couple games where he's had big games and games where he pretty much has been pedestrian the majority of the season, where he's scoring only anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. But this week, a good matchup with the Tennessee Titans. That give up tons of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. But like I said, Tyler Lockett's been inconsistent. We don't know if it's going to be Geno unlocked, but for the most part, he's not getting the football in places where he's going out there making the big plays, and he's just not hitting as well on that deep ball, where many seasons we've seen a lot of deep ball plays and performances by Tyler Lockett. 31, Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Mason Rudolph in there, quarterback for the Steelers team. And Johnson, believe it or not, has had 3 games in a row with a touchdown. So this week in a matchup versus Cincinnati Bengals, where this Bengal offense has been playing well, you know, this Steelers team's going to have to move the football. But obviously going to the 3rd-string quarterback is never good, no matter who the receiver is. I know Deontay Johnson's a good route runner. I know he's got great hands, but those touchdowns have definitely saved him over the last few weeks, where he would have had pedestrian games at 7 to 10 point fantasy range. So right now, Deontay Johnson's ceiling really isn't all that good, but in PPR leagues, he could get you that 8-9 fantasy points, I believe a minimum. 32, DeAndre Hopkins of the Tennessee Titans. So DeAndre Hopkins, it really hasn't been that good of a season for him over here in his first year in Tennessee. We've seen some pop games out of him, no doubt about it, on and off the season, but usually he's scoring anywhere from 9 to 12 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And this week here, it's a middle-of-the-pack matchup with the Seahawks coming to Tennessee. So Hopkins, he might not be Will Levis in this one, where him and Ryan Tannehill pretty much had no rapport at all. At least with Will Levis, he's got a good arm, and him and Hopkins connected on some deep balls this season here. Tweak here with either Will Levis not 100% with the ankle sprains or Tannehill at quarterback. I don't really see DeAndre Hopkins doing much. So right now, anywhere from that 9 to 12 point fantasy range is definitely a possibility once again for Hopkins. And he's a low end 2 to flex option. 33, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens is Zay Flowers. He's been decent in his rookie season for this Baltimore Raven team. A gadget guy. They've used him as well in the formation, moving around. Jet sweeps we've seen at time, end arounds as well. And he's a speedy wide receiver, no doubt about it, but he's been inconsistent as well over the last few weeks, and rightfully so, in an offense where the ball's going to be in Lamar Jackson's hand, where he's going to run the football a lot as well. And this week at San Francisco, though, you know they're going to have to move the football up and down the field if they want to win this game as Baltimore. And this is a potential Super Bowl matchup between these two teams. So right here, I think Zay Flowers could go out there and be a decent option, but I'm not banking on a big ball game. Like I said, with a rookie inconsistent season and also a tougher matchup. 34, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So Drake London this week will have Taylor Heineke in there, quarterback, which I think is an upgrade for him in this Falcon offense as a whole over Desmond Ridder. Because Desmond Ridder, we've seen enough of him this season where he just can't cut it, where they took him out for a few weeks, went to Heineke, and then back to Ridder, and this offense wasn't getting anything going. So Taylor Heineke at least is a gunslinger. He's not afraid to take chances down the field and get the football, and that's the type of football Drake London likes playing, getting that deep ball, working the middle of the field on the slants, and getting those out routes to the sidelines. And this week versus Indianapolis, even though it's a decent matchup and he's got an upgraded quarterback, in my opinion, you still can't count on Drake London to go out there and have a huge ball game. So right now, he's another receiver falling in that flex option at best, range 35, Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. So we'll see if Reed plays in this ball game. Last week he left with a leg injury, didn't return. So this week a decent matchup at the Panthers. Believe it or not, though, the Panthers give up the sixth least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season, where all the damage is really much done on this defense on the ground. But Jayden Reed's been a good gadget guy in this offense. They've used him in different formations, kind of in that Deebo Samuel role. They've used Jayden Reed coming off of jet sweeps, even taking some carries in the backfield as well at times. So this week, if Jayden Reed plays, I think his upside's pretty decent in a matchup at the Carolina Panthers. And the 36th and final wide receiver I'm ranking is Adam Thielen, staying in the same game of the Carolina Panthers. So Thielen, he got off to a monster start the first 6-7 weeks of the season, but he's really come back down to earth, where teams are focusing in on stopping Adam Thielen and making Bryce Young try to get the ball to Jonathan Mingo and DJ Chark to try for those guys to beat their defenses. So this week here, not that bad of a matchup versus the Packers, where over the last few weeks they've given up a lot of points, and receivers have had field days, including last week Chris Godwin, like I said, going over 140 yards. But right now, like I said, defenses are zeroing in on Thielen. Jair Alexander possibly might return in this game, and Thielen ceiling right now pretty much anywhere from 9 to 12 fantasy points as well. He had the bigger games, no doubt, early in the year, 25, 30 points, but I think those games aren't going to happen. And how could you really trust him to go out there and put in a huge performance as Thielen? After the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season, he hasn't done much. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking here for week 16 of the fantasy football season.